Putin's problem is that he doesn't have anybody who's really all that good in his government, in his military, and his law enforcement, everywhere. For the last 22 years, excellence wasn't rewarded. What was rewarded was loyalty, and in order to have people be loyal to him, he allowed them to be corrupt. He allowed them to steal in whatever their area was. And so you ended up in this situation where the country over 22 years has been completely hollowed out. That's the reason why Russia didn't win this war in 3 days, as everybody has predicted. And that's the reason why nothing seems to work in any part of Russia.
So, Bill, as recently as this morning, we were seeing drone attacks on Moscow. What does this mean for Vladimir Putin?
Well, when Putin started this war, he wanted to do something where he was attacking Ukraine, hopefully winning the war, and he called it a special military operation for a very specific purpose, which was he didn't want the Russian people to think that it was a war. Um, it's much easier for them to get sort of nationalistic, stand behind him on some narrowly defined special military operation. But it all of a sudden looks very much like a war if bombs are exploding in Moscow. And I think that's the intention of the Ukrainians, is not so much to do damage or to harm people, but to let the Russian people know that this is a war. It affects them just as much as it affects the Ukrainian people.
And Putin also seems to be reshuffling his generals for younger and yet slightly less charismatic figures. What do you make of that decision by him?
His problem, Putin's problem, is that he doesn't have anybody who's really all that good in his government, in his military, and his law enforcement, everywhere. For the last 22 years, excellence wasn't rewarded. What was rewarded was loyalty, and in order to have people be loyal to him, he allowed them to be corrupt. He allowed them to steal in whatever their area was. And so you ended up in this situation where the country over 22 years has been completely hollowed out. That's the reason why Russia didn't win this war in 3 days, as everybody has predicted. And that's the reason why nothing seems to work in any part of Russia. The economy is totally lackluster because the entire sort of fabric of society has been hollowed out by corruption. And so he has this problem which permeates everything, including the military. And so now he's in a position where he's got real fundamental existential issues. He started a war. The Ukrainians are fighting back. If the Ukrainians win the war and expel the Russian troops from Ukraine, the Russian people aren't going to allow him to be president anymore. And if he's not president in that part of the world, you go to jail and you probably die. And so Putin has got to do something now to try to upgrade his war efforts. He can't just allow the slouching, corrupt, ossified generals do it. And so he's scrambling and looking for ways to succeed. It didn't work. He had allowed these private military companies to form and to participate in the battle. And what ended up happening was that he had a bunch of people who became all too powerful in these private military companies, like Yevgeny Prigozhin, who didn't show loyalty to him. So he's stuck in a place where his normal military generals don't work. He can't have private military companies because that just threatens his own power. And so he's scrambling. He's looking for any angle, any way he can try to turn this thing around.
And there are reports, I mean, you mentioned Prigozhin, and there are reports that 13 Russian pilots died in his mutiny. And that kind of comes alongside a lack of ammunition that's being complained about. Does this growing discontent in the Russian military, could we see it amount to anything, either civilians or within the military itself?
I always thought that the mothers of the dead soldiers would be the political force that would change things. That had been the case when during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Russia lost about 15,000 soldiers, and it was the mothers who somehow were the ones to bring change. Here, you've got a situation where the Russians are closing on a gap of are closing on a number of about 250,000 dead soldiers, which is almost 20 times the losses in Afghanistan. And the mothers hadn't come out to protest yet. And the primary reason is that they're all too scared. They're scared of being thrown in jail for 8 years or something like that. And so, but it's, of course, in any society, if you lose 250,000 young men, there's got to be pressure. There's got to be cracks. There's got to be something. And I think the first sign of that was this aborted mutiny by Prigozhin. He was basically saying, send me ammunition. We're cannon fodder. People are dying en masse. They refused to send him ammunition. I think mainly to try to limit his power. But in any event, that was one sign of that. And I'm sure it's just impossible to have a society where you have that kind of loss and you don't have some kind of reaction. And whether it's the mothers or Prigozhin or some other force, that has to be the case as these deaths continue to mount.
Robert Fox was on last week, and he said that negotiations are likely to be presented to Ukraine and Russia at the UN this autumn. Many people would argue, though, that any scenario in which Russia is allowed to retain any piece of land would allow Putin to present it as a victory to his own people. Is there a worry that if negotiations are the way out of this war, if neither side can survive another winter on the battlefield, that Putin just is going to look like he got away with it?
Well, I don't believe that there's any chance of any kind of negotiated deal whatsoever. Putin has never, in the 23 years he's been in power, ever shown any ability to negotiate or compromise, ever. And for one simple reason, because if he were to do that, it would basically show weakness. Russia is a country that despises weakness, particularly among their strong men. And that weakness would lead to people challenging his authority, and he would probably lose power. And so Putin's only reason for being there at this point is to stay in power in order to stay alive. And so I don't see any negotiation on his side. And the Ukrainians, and Zelensky in particular, were very keen to negotiate in the first week, 2, 3 of the war. I can remember him effectively begging for negotiation. But after the unbelievable numbers of atrocities, war crimes, deaths, kidnappings, rapes, and $1 trillion of property damage, I don't see the Ukrainians giving up an inch of their territory. I don't think that there's any political will whatsoever to do that. And in fact, I think if Zelensky were to do that, he probably wouldn't survive as president. And so you have a situation where neither side is going to negotiate. And furthermore, I don't think that NATO and the United States and the UK want Ukraine to capitulate in any way, because everybody understands that if Putin is allowed to get away with any of this type of stuff, he's going to have another go, and then he'll eventually have a go at NATO countries. And so whatever fantasies people have about peace treaties, those are just fantasies. It's not going to happen. And so we've had many, the Chinese and the Africans, and now I guess the United Nations, all sorts of people are going to try to present these negotiations, but nothing is going to happen.
And yeah, you're pointing to this sense that many people have kind of spoken about, which is that no matter how well Ukraine does on the front line, even if they have some kind of World War I type victory, the conflict won't finish in that region until Putin's out of power. But if we look to who Putin's successor might be, do you think we could have another kind of Gorbachev type leader willing to work with the West, or is Russia just surrendered itself to having presidents like Putin for as long as the country exists?
Well, I think it's totally unclear. Putin has created this image over the last 22 years that he is indispensable, that he's the only person who could hold Russia together, that better Putin than the alternative, that many other people are worse and crazier. And here we are in a situation where This is the third war that Putin has launched. Um, uh, he started with Georgia. He then went into Crimea. Now all of Ukraine, and we should add on, of course, carpet bombing Syria on behalf of Assad. And so he's a terribly dangerous man. He's threatened nuclear war. He's already now embarked on a food war with the world by restricting wheat exports to Africa, an environmental war by blowing up a dam and flooding a huge part of southwest or southeast Ukraine. Um, and so for us to say, oh God, who could be after Putin? Could it be worse? Could it? I don't think we should even be thinking those thoughts. The first and most important thing is that this man is a menace to the world. We should do everything possible to starve him of financial resources so that he can't pay for this war. We should do everything we can to help the Ukrainians with military equipment so they can defeat him on the battlefield. And then we'll let the chips fall where they may. And after that, we should have a very strong containment strategy for whatever comes next. And maybe something good comes next. It's possible. And if somebody like Alexei Navalny or Vladimir Kara-Murza, who are two opposition figures in jail, emerge, then great. And we could work with Russia, and Russia could pay reparations, et cetera. If a more likely scenario is some other hardliner kleptocrat comes in, then we put up the Iron Curtain, a very tough Iron Curtain. We let Ukraine into NATO, and we tell them that if they take one bad step, then terrible things will happen. And we actually survived very well in a Cold War, where Russia didn't do anything, or the Soviet Union didn't do anything because of this Iron Curtain. And now we've got a hot war. We need to get this hot war ended with a defeat of Russia. And then we worry about what happens next by having the right disincentives for them to ever do anything like this again.
And you spoke there about the containment of Russia. I mean, even Putin has warned that, he's facing a threat that the Russian Federation could be broken up into separate states. And I mean, it seems like what he's been aiming to do is to reclaim old Soviet territory, which has backfired because now we're having a conversation about Russia existing an entirely new entity. I mean, do you think that that's likely, that maybe we'll see some kind of East-West Germany type situation taking hold?
Well, this has always been his spin that Russia will disintegrate without him, and that I don't believe that to be the case. But if Chechnya wants to become independent, and if Tatarstan wants to become independent, it's not really our business to get involved in that. Our business is to make sure that Russia doesn't pose a risk to the civilized world, and we appeased Russia, we appeased Putin for 2 decades, and this is what we end up with, which is hundreds of thousands, if not more, dead, many millions of refugees, huge economic costs to the world, and we should just be absolutely tough in whatever comes next, and it's not our business to regime build in Russia afterwards. It's our business to make sure that the incentives are there so they don't do this again.
When the war ended, you talked a little bit about kind of Ukraine joining NATO and just kind of really fortifying that border. There's some people that also warn that we could see a demilitarized zone along that border. And, it might turn out like the Korean War, like that. It's just a conflict that's frozen in time. I mean, that wouldn't exactly be a great alternative to what we have. I mean, it would be an alternative in that it's not an active warfare. But do you think that that's likely?
Well, I think that first of all, I predict that this war is not going to end anytime soon, and I would say that the war didn't start on February 24th, 2022. This war started in 2014 when Russia took Crimea, and that was an act of war, and it's continued since then. And so the war has been going on for 9 years now, and the war will probably go on for another 9 years. And unless we give the Ukrainians what they need to finish this thing. And if it goes on and on and on, there could be one of these North Korea, South Korea type of scenarios. That would be an undesirable scenario. The best scenario, and really the only acceptable scenario for the West, is for Ukraine to win. And for Ukraine to win, we've got to do more than we're doing. The Ukrainians have been begging for jets. They've been begging for long-range missiles. They've been begging for more artillery, and we have all that to supply the Ukrainians. But we're not giving it to them, and so I can only hope that that's the alternative.
I just wanted to finally ask you, I mean, we're both Americans, and I don't know if you have like any wish of ever returning or ever going to Russia. But do you think that it's possible in either of our lifetimes that we'll ever be able to safely enter that country?
Well, you could probably enter it more safely than I could at some point. I'm I'm like number one on various lists, arrest warrant lists, and hit lists, and so on and so forth. Um, but it's entirely possible. I mean, I think that the Putin regime is on its last legs. I think that Putin has way overextended himself in this terrible war. He thought it would be a 3-day war where he could shore up his popularity, and I think this is the war that will end his power. Um, it's possible that we have a good, some good political outcome at the end of this whole thing when all the kleptocrats and Putin cronies flee the country. Maybe the prison gates open and the Russian opposition is the political format where this thing goes. If that were the case, then all sorts of good things could happen. I think it's a low probability scenario, but who knows? I mean, it's so hard to predict these things, and nobody can really predict how it's going to play itself out. And certainly, the person who can't predict it the most is Putin, who's sitting there scared to death every day that he's going to be hung from a lamppost.